until I was much old, like I was a teenager, people would sort of come up to my parents and say, isn't it, you should really try for a boy. What are you going to do with two girls, right? And my father was adamant.
Hi, Bu Sujala.
Hello.
Very nice to meet you today, and
Nice
thank
to
you
meet you.
for agreeing to do this interview. So, can you introduce yourself and your role in UNDP Indonesia for our audience?
Sure. So thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Sujala Pant, and I'm the UNDP Deputy Resident Representative here at UNDP Indonesia. I've been in Jakarta for more than just over a year and a half. And my role is quite wide encompassing. We are a very large program operating in all parts of Indonesia, and I'm very much responsible to make sure that we're delivering on our commitments and are doing so efficiently with the resources we have. So it's a very exciting and demanding position.
Yes, I can imagine. So today we want to talk about gender mainstreaming and what it means and what does UNDP do. And so we're going to start first by defining what is actually gender mainstreaming. Can you explain, because to a lot of people they don't understand what it means?
Sure. Gender mainstreaming, I think, is a word we often hear now. And for me, that in of itself is a success because we're talking about it. But sometimes when you hear a word so much, you maybe forget what it is about, essentially, fundamentally. And gender mainstreaming is really about understanding that women and men have different needs. They have different priorities, they have different challenges. The fact that we have physiologically we're different, we have different needs, and those need to be understood in order for us to move forward on the responses. So I think that's what mainstreaming has to be about, putting in the core processes the considerations of women, young women, girls, women, etc. Perhaps a more focused example is a WHO study has found that one of the leading causes of death, in children is drowning, and drowning or flash floods or floods are something that we're seeing a lot more because of the impacts of climate change, right? And it was found that when flash floods happen, girls and women were more likely to drown than boys or men. Now, why is that? Because for a variety of reasons, women and girls, whether they're social or cultural reasons, girls and women are not encouraged to maybe take up swimming. Or the access to public spaces like rivers or swimming pools are maybe more restrictive for them. So it means when disasters strike, they don't actually have the reflex and the knowledge of how to swim to be able to potentially survive those. So when we look at, for instance, disaster risk reduction programs, we need to be aware of those differences. So it's not just addressing disaster risk response from a technical perspective only, but it's also you have to build in perhaps swimming lessons for girls of affected communities for your responses to really have a chance to be successful and sustainable. So I think for me these are quite relevant and practical examples of what is gender mainstreaming. Ultimately, it's understanding the differences and then including those in your responses and the actions that you take because of the questions that you ask.
That's really interesting, and we've seen that this is becoming even more mainstream, this idea that you have to consider this gender lens. But why is it now seen as more important than, like, say, 2010 or even 30 years ago? Why is there acknowledgement now? And why do you think it's important for us?
So there are a couple of reasons. I think it's interesting. Next year will be 2025, which is 30 years after the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted in Beijing in '95. And I think that was a really important turnaround time, or turning point rather, for the agenda around gender empowerment and women's equality. It was the first time that the majority of governments understood why it is so important that we address gender empowerment and women's equality in a holistic manner. So it's not just maternal health, or so maybe things that we more directly associate with women, but it's really about every aspect of life, whether it's economic, whether it's social, whether it's environmental, requires women to be part of that picture. Whether as beneficiaries or as active, participants in those processes. So I think that was an important turning point. That's one. Number two, I think gender equality and women's empowerment is about human rights. It's about the human rights of women to be treated with dignity, to have equal opportunity, and a recognition that ensuring that means that we will also be addressing past social injustices, but also systemic failures that we've had in the past when their needs were not taken into account. So I think that realization is much more acute. And then thirdly, we often like to put numbers and quantify why something is important. It has been shown that women being more active in the labor force, them being more economically empowered, them being in more decision-making positions will have positive impacts on economic growth and development outcomes and GDP. Right. So their contribution to the economy is also going to be that's how it's been articulated, that their involvement will actually have all of these co-benefits. So I think there's different parallel dimensions that people have internalized to really put the kind of importance that we see today.
That's very clear. So when we talk about gender mainstreaming, are there any principles or elements that you have to think about?
I think firstly, we have to unpack the issue, right? So as we said in the beginning, it's about empowerment and participation. At UNDP, gender empowerment and women's equality is really a guiding principle for everything we do. So it's not something that's optional. It's not something that is dependent on one person's preference or not. It's something that we corporately have to abide by. And I think the commitments that we've seen with the Beijing Platform for Action also means, for example, the Beijing Platform for Action, it means that there is also an expectation that governments and also other partners, civil society, academia, etc., have committed to. So, and I don't think that changes. So once that starting point is clear, it's then really analyzing what are the root causes of the discrimination or the unequal opportunities or unequal impacts. What is causing that? And you can't do that by not talking to women or having their direct engagement with them. So the inclusion of women is fundamental. It's very much aligned to our, what we call the leaving no one behind agenda, which is we want to make sure as UNDP that whatever we do is inclusive of different groups of society. But women are, it's almost a different category because women are 50% of the population. So how can you even ignore 50% of the population, right? With that, analyzing and understanding what are the causes, and that's not enough. Then you have to basically decide what do you do with these findings. So to go back to my example earlier about more women and girls likely to drown, if your research tells you that, then whatever action you decide to take should actually take into account that challenge and build it into your response. Right. So it's analysis, it's then action, and then you also have to measure. So it's not just about the inputs, right? You also want to make sure that the investments that you're making are actually having the kind of positive results and impacts at the end of the day. And, you know, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, we used to say, oh, number of women participants. And if you had a high level of women participants, it was like, great job.
That's enough.
Yeah, right? And it's not. We know it's not enough, because you could have the women in the room, but if they're not able to say anything, if they're not claiming the space or given the space, then it doesn't matter. Right. So it's also about empowerment in that beyond just the numbers. So yeah, I think understanding, then taking the necessary action, and then really reflecting on whether this has the kind of intended results is very much at the heart of you know, what gender mainstreaming should be about.
Right. In a lot of, I guess, societies, gender inequalities are also linked to certain traditions or beliefs or the social systems and whatnot. When we're thinking of a gender mainstreaming strategy, are there more country or culture specific? Like, how do you include that in your thought process?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I think it's a very difficult one in some ways. So first of all, women are not homogeneous. You and I are women living in urban areas, but we're still very different, right? Just like a younger woman's priorities will be very different from an older one, a mother versus a single woman, a person living in an urban area, a rural area. So those differences are there. And with that, you know, there are also cultural, social associations that come with who you are as an individual, whether you're a man or a woman. So yes, there are always differences. So you cannot have what we call a cookie cutter approach. It has to be really specific to the needs, the circumstances of the person, of the community, and that will come with their own specific social customs, etc., which need to be taken into account. But my third point is maybe one of the most, I think is the most important, is you have to listen to the women affected to decide, well, how do you address those challenges? Because we're complex individuals, and one person cannot speak for someone else. So this is again very much part of our practice, where we really encourage women's voice and participation, right? So it's not just numbers and sitting in the back, but are women actually actively contributing to the discussions and the decisions that are being discussed and agreed upon? Because without that, you're by default sort of contradicting your commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment. So where those differences need to be taken into account, I think women are the best placed to assess how that can be done and what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. I also want to know if there's some misconception about gender mainstreaming, and I'm not just thinking of like public misconception, but also like maybe in policies or in dealing maybe with certain government or certain community initiatives. How are some of this misconception about gender mainstreaming lead to, I guess, counter the effect or the impact that you want to attain?
Yeah, that's another tough one.
Yes.
So at the beginning, when we started, we said, sometimes gender mainstreaming can be quite cliche.
Right.
And often you'll hear people laugh at like, oh, yeah, it's gender mainstreaming. We just have to add like the right word, and then it will be taken care of. So maybe there is a little bit also of, what's the right word? A bit of kind of like, yeah, it's there, we're paying attention to it, but what does it actually mean, right? So there is a little bit maybe of that pushback, if you will. Yeah. But I think that one of the other, maybe on a more serious note, one of the bigger misconceptions is that gender is only about women, and it's not. Because enabling the kind of change that we want to see in terms of women having more access to resources, financial resources, social services, being able to go to school or take up jobs requires a shift in the way our societies have been set up, right? And that's what I mean when in the beginning I referred to systemic structures that have really been the framework within which we've had to operate. And women will not be able to change that on their own. You need men as champions as well. And you know, I really believe that recognizing the extremely important contribution that men have made and need to continue to make to really realize you know, the reality of gender empowerment and equality is extremely important. You know, if you'll allow me, I'll give you a very personal example. It's me and my sister in my family, and you know, until I was much old, like I was a teenager, people would sort of come up to my parents and say, "Oh, isn't it? You know, you should really try for a boy. What are you going to do with two girls, right?" And my father was adamant. When I was going to university overseas, people would be like, "Why are you spending so much money to send your daughter out to study?" And he was so adamant that it was the most important investment he would ever make would be in our education. And you know, as the main breadwinner of the family, it really was his decision to go this way or that way. And he chose to go, perhaps, you know, you have to stand up to society and their kind of misconceptions. So for as much as I've had many women role models in my life, I'm also extremely aware of the role that my father or grandfather have played. And I think that translates into the workplace as well. So in offices, you know, where you have senior managers or leadership who are men, I think their actions and their commitment to gender equality and empowerment, but also putting that into action through very concrete little steps that they can take is crucial. You need champions that are not just women to achieve women's empowerment and gender equality.
Well, thank you for that personal reflection as well.